Thanks, guys. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm just going to I'm going to talk a little bit about one title I have, which was bestowed on me by Vice, which is a masculinity expert. It's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but I think it's a great way to start about like a larger conversation about gender that I'm really interested in having all the time. So in 2013, I began writing a column for Vice, and it was funny that they were calling me masculinity expert because I'd only been a man, in the literal sense of being on testosterone for about 3 years. And now I give talks about masculinity all over the country, and I'm writing a new book based on a column I'm writing for the Pacific Standard, and I don't know what the book will be called, but the column's called The American Man. So I guess the first sort of question is, how did this happen? How did I become a masculinity expert in 4 years or less? So to me, in many ways, the story starts with the book, Man Alive, which I began writing in 2010, but sort of the narrative started way before that. And how I became a man and a masculinity expert in general is really the story of how I became myself. So that's where I'd like to start. So I'm going to read you guys a little bit from the book, and I'll read a little bit more in a few minutes, and then we'll take questions in a little bit, because I think questions are much more fun, and I want to know who you all are and why you're here, which is the most interesting thing to me. So this is the prologue of the book, which I think sets us up pretty nicely. South Carolina, August 2010, 29 years old. What makes a man? It's not that I haven't studied them, their sinew, their slang, their beautiful bristle, but before I was held at gunpoint on a cold April day, I couldn't have told you. A real man, a family man, the Marlboro man, man up, the man in the mirror. I loved that Michael Jackson song growing up, used to forget my girl hips, used to sing it to my best imagination of myself. What makes a man? The need to know led me to my father's hometown in hot, damp South Carolina. The story starts there because that's where I went when I could no longer afford to leave the question alone, to let it rear up every few years when I'd had too much to drink and it was just me and my reflection and my hungry ghosts. And so I steered my rental through the swampy South with my cap pulled low. I had that teen boy swagger, scars like smiles across my chest, and a body I was just beginning to love. But the story also begins the night I almost died, back in April of 2010, and in 1985, when my father became a monster, and in 1990, when my mom found out he was one. Men, she'd said then. And I learned to say it the same way, a lemon in my mouth. In South Carolina, I could smell it through my open window. Alligators and secrets, the embers of Sherman's March, the Ku Klux Klan, my father's farm, burning. It smelled like my animal fear, and the spicy deodorant I used to cover it. Men, I thought, with that old bitterness, but I already knew my body was shifting. In fact, that's why I was there. A good man is hard to find. The windshield blurred, the road was inky, the rain biblical. The cheap motel off the highway seemed like not such a hot idea after I passed my 5th gun-racked pickup, but there wasn't any turning back. Once a body's in motion, it stays in motion. My mom's a physicist. She told me that. The truth is, this is a ghost story. No, this is an adventure story. This is an adventure story about how I quit being a ghost. So that's where we start. It's 2010. A little background. This was before my transition. I looked very masculine, and in April of that year, I was mugged from behind and held execution style at gunpoint by this man, George Huggins, who went on to actually shoot 2 other men and kill one in the process. So what was really interesting about this for me was that I was released when I spoke, when my voice came out of my mouth. Up until that point, I don't think that George Huggins realized that I wasn't male. And what was really amazing to me was that actually set me on this whole story that it turned around my ideas of what gender sort of meant, and it set me free in a lot of ways, and I was really interested in that, which is where the book came from, because I got to run away, and it gave me a new angle on not just my body, but also my story in general. And obviously there's a Google connection here. So 2011, I guess at this point I was asking myself a lot of questions about like if it's possible to be a good man. I was revisiting by doing that my examples of like the worst examples of masculinity, because that was sort of what was holding me up in general. And I meant in a lot of ways the worst examples were my father, which I know a lot of men can relate to that, and also of course Mr. Huggins himself. And what I was really interested in, too, was just exploring the universals of masculinity. I didn't ever think of myself as just a trans man, having to figure out what it is to be trans, I thought of myself as a man figuring out what it is to be a man, which I think a lot of men really struggle with what that really means. So I'll read you a little bit more from the book just to give you a little more context of what that looked like. You know, I'm an artist, so I don't ever pretend to speak on anybody else's behalf. I'm not speaking on behalf of the trans community or anything, but I think when we can listen to like one person's story, we learn a lot about all of our stories. So I could tell that Dad charmed people. Everyone gravitated to his lilting Southern accent, his aw-shucks smile, and his good manners. He seemed youthful, refined, and so it was easy to overlook his silver halo, forget that he was in his 50s, way older than Mom. But people can hold their true selves at bay for only so long. I knew that from Batman. Today he looked worn out, exposed, waiting for us in the leather chair, his remaining hair unkempt, gray stubble crowding his face. His knuckles were thick, swollen as an old man's, and he wore his exercise clothes, a gray tracksuit, coffee-stained. He looked like the raggedy dog he'd once shot in the butt with a BB gun for crossing onto our property one too many times. "What are you doing?" Mom had said on the sunny porch that afternoon a few years before, her voice laced with alarm. Maybe she'd never seen that side of him, but I knew it intimately, and how he'd look when he turned around, smiling that dumb, menacing smile. Of course one man can become another. Where two sides meet comes the potential for ghosts, dissonant smears, rips in the story. It was only his ass, he'd said, in that gentle accent, unloading the BBs carefully into his palm, just teaching him a lesson. The dog never did come back. Where I grew up, in western Pennsylvania, deer were hunted to keep the population down. Still, we'd put out salt licks and watch whole families wander by. I found I could open the door and approach them as long as I moved slowly enough. They'd lock eyes with me, ears pricked, stuck, as if stopped by time. I get closer and closer, 5 yards, 4, 3. I reach a hand out greedily, and like magic, their eyes would pop open a little, their bodies hunching into themselves. Then, always, they'd spring awake and bound away, big and graceful, alive. There was an invisible line, a wire I'd trip, and it was different each time, 4 yards, 2. Every body has a different threshold, but we all know how to run eventually. Most people don't realize that. We never forget how to escape. So once I was convinced that there was a way to be a good man, that's when I began my transition in 2011. So I was 30 years old at the time. And because I'm a writer and I work in media, one thing that I was really interested in was I didn't see my story anywhere, not just my story of like, you know, what it is to be a trans man, but again, the kind of man I wanted to be. I never felt very connected to the idea of being born in the wrong body, which was the narrative that was out there. It's hard to imagine this was just a few years ago, but really if you saw any stories about a trans person in media, you were seeing a story about someone being murdered, or you were seeing these sort of like soft, you know, heart-wrenching stories about how people were trapped in their bodies and they just needed to transition and make their lives better so they could be in a different body, and then everything was perfect after that. And I didn't really relate to either of those narratives. So what I thought a lot about was like when I was becoming a man, what I was really becoming was an intentional human being. And since I didn't see my story anywhere, I just started writing it. So I wrote stories for Salon and The Atlantic and Vice and The New York Times. I just wanted to write myself into existence. I really believe that the most violent thing we can do to each other is make each other other. Pretend that an experience that's human, that any one of us is experiencing, is somehow really radically different than an experience another of us could have. And I found that very, very violent and very upsetting. So my goal from the very beginning has been to say, you know, this is my particular story, but it's a story any of us could have. I'm a universalist. And I really think in a lot of ways my transition wasn't about female to male. That's really simple. I think it was about young adult to adult, which I think most people can relate to. And I'm a kind of person who I see similarities everywhere. I mean, when I was transitioning, I related most to like pregnant women. I lived in New England. I didn't have a trans community, so I spent a lot of time with women who were having a lot of hormonal changes and who were wondering who they were going to be once they had their baby and what this identity would mean for them. And you know, those were the people I was connecting to most. So my work has always been about that. So that's what I was doing in 2012. Also, I was writing this column called The Self-Made Man, which I started when I was a few months on testosterone because I didn't have a community and I didn't see myself anywhere, and I've been lucky enough to write it for the last 2 years now. And I think in a lot of ways this was capturing like the big questions of my book and just my life in general. It opens, this is the very first one, what does it mean to be a man? To me, it means a lot and nothing at all. It means I'm 30 years old and I love my body. It means that men look at me and see an ally or a threat. It means nothing is what it seems, that none of us can look at another and know what's in his pants or his heart, and that surprise is inevitable, but how you react to it is who you are. And that's a lot of like the question I was asking, and really I guess I knew the answer all along. So by last year, 2013, I was asking and answering this question, all over the place, and it sort of moved on to a different question. Instead of what makes a man, I was asking, how do we become more than what's sold to us? Meaning, we have an understanding of what masculinity means, but where do we get that understanding? I think my experience is that gender is kind of innate. Like, I think that we, in a lot of ways, are born at least having some understanding of who we are in the world, but the way that we embody that gender is something that we have a lot of choice around. So I wasn't ever interested in specifically writing about the trans experience, but I was interested in writing about the male experience and the human experience. And I think gender is just one very powerful dimension of identity. And it's just a way for me personally to examine that. So I think in the end, when I was asking the question of what makes a man, what I really meant was what makes a good man. And I think I spent a lot of time talking to men about gender because I think a lot of men don't even realize they have one, which is basically the definition of privilege, is to move in the world thinking that something is invisible when really it's not at all. So being able to make it visible is a really cool, important thing that hopefully I get to do for people. And I also think with privilege comes a lot of responsibility, and that's where being a good man comes in. There's a lot of toxic ideas about masculinity out there in the world, and there's a way to be very healthy in your masculinity, and that's something that I think a lot about. And I think the first step is just understanding that if you can see it, you can change it. For one thing, I know I'm treated very differently. I do a lot of talks to people about workspace stuff, about sexism at work, because I'm treated very differently in a male body than in my previous body, which wasn't female, actually. I would say it was more a queer body. So the way people reacted to me was very different than the way people react to me now. I'm given a lot more room and a lot more respect. People listen to me more. And I spend a lot of time thinking about how different bodies are treated in space, and how, as a person in a leadership role in media, I can make sure that people who aren't male in the sort of passing male way that I am, especially straight white men, we can make more room for people who are not those bodies. And again, I think a lot of it's just having some intention and just having some awareness about, if you're lucky enough to be in a body that has privilege in this world, how do you operate in such a way to make room for everyone else? So now, today, 2014, I write this column, like I said, The American Man, for the Pacific Standard, and basically it's a broad survey of masculinity, really white American masculinity, and I go to a bunch of places. Like, I went to a boxing gym, I've been to a bathhouse, I'm going to frats, and basically just reporting back Gonzo style. So this is a little excerpt from one about like going to a boxing gym. But I think that the main point is that, when I think about being a man today, what I'm thinking about being so much more than just a man moving in space, but being an intentional human being. And again, just making that visible. So finally, I think now where I'm at in 2014, thinking about what being an expert about being a man is, which I think all people who are men are, it just is sort of, there's a cone in Zen, Zen mind, beginner's mind. Basically, I don't know if anybody here is familiar with this cone, but I find it very useful, which is basically that to be an expert is to have a very closed mind when you think you know everything, but to be a beginner, that's where real creativity and expertise comes from. So I think in a lot of ways, like, my journey into masculinity was one of a beginner's mind. And what I've come up with as my answer of what makes a man is, like I said, I think gender in a lot of ways is innate. I think especially in queer circles, there's an idea that gender is performance, and maybe so, but I think that doesn't quite explain my experience. Like, I knew I was a guy, what does that mean? At the other end of it, the paradox is that I also think it's really constructed, and I think we have a lot of choice about what kind of men and women and everything else we want to be in the world. So I think a man, and a good man specifically, is intentional, and I think a good man makes himself. And so that's what I found in my journey. I'm happy to take questions. I guess my only caveat that I tend to give about this is just I love Q&As. I really would love to answer any questions. Any question you ask me is one you'd have to be willing to answer yourself. I've only had to use that a couple times, but. So does anybody have anything that they want to ask me? Or any statements about, I don't know, masculinity or maleness or queerness? Yes?
You talked a little bit about how you were treated very differently before your transition. Could you talk a little bit more about what happened?
Yeah, so I think I didn't know I was treated differently. Because I didn't have a really typical like feminine female presentation, I think a lot of women who are in the world in a feminine way are very aware of that difference because we talk about it a lot, but I was very queer and masculine, which is a different thing. But still, at the end of the day, I think I didn't read as male in that way. So again, I don't think there was like one way I was being treated that I could pinpoint, but I do know that suddenly when I'm in spaces like work meetings, people pay more attention to what I have to say. You know, I have a lower voice and I talk lower. I'm actually harder to hear, but people are quiet and they lean in and they listen. And generally, I think that women are socialized in a lot of ways to like sort of hang back or be very conscientious about what everyone else is saying around them, and men really aren't. And so I really was aware of that very quickly, that like, you know, me being male with a male voice in a male space, if I spoke, everyone would turn to me, and I was much more aggressive about communicating, whereas women in the same spaces or people who are gender nonconforming in the same spaces might not be as aggressive or emboldened, and I was noticing that a lot. I was working at this place called Policy Mike, now Mike, where we had a very young staff, and I was managing editor there. So I worked really hard when I was there to try to make a lot of room for women in the space to speak. Because again, I don't think any of this is an intentional sexism. I think it's actually just socialized differences and then lack of awareness. And the more we make something visible, the more, you know, it becomes a thing that people are conscientious about. Yeah.
So when you go and talk to men about being more intentional, especially men who may not see their privilege, et cetera, what are the kinds of roadblocks that you find that when you come to somebody, what's the first thing where they sort of push back?
Yeah. I've actually found it's a lot more helpful to ask questions than it is, you know, I think I actually talk to a lot of women who say, I'm very frustrated because I tried to explain to my boyfriend what privilege means and he doesn't get it because he's saying, you know, well, I've had a hard life, like, or this is my particular life circumstance and you're not really making room for it. That makes a lot of sense because we're interpersonal creatures, but we also live in an institutionalized world. So being able to hold both at once, and you know, I think a lot of men get very defensive because they think, I'm trying to be a good guy here, like why are you attacking me, or why am I having to hold the weight of every male and whoever has existed or whatever. But of course that is part of the privilege of being male, is you have to hold the weight of every man who's ever existed before you. On the other hand, I think a lot of times men want to engage with this question, in my experience. They actually really want to live in a world that's not as constraining to them. Sexism hurts men too. So and a way around sort of just being in a weird kind of defensive space with people is to say, like, you know, well, what is masculinity, you know? What do you mean when you say that you feel like you can only act this way? Or when you say this thing about women, like, what are you actually saying right now? Like, just sort of opening it up to have a conversation has been a really easy way to dig into like what's really troubling for everybody, which is like that we're in these very rigid spaces culturally that are hurting all of us. So my biggest roadblock is that men, in my experience, when they feel on the defensive, because they feel like they're having to be responsive in a way that, you know, is like, whoa, 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 I'm not doing anything wrong. Like that is the same way as like open communication, you know, with a couple, where it's like, I'm feeling this way when you do X. Like, it's so much easier to sort of come at it from a more, you know, assuming the best kind of place. And again, most men I talk to are actually very responsive. Yeah.
So we live in a world where being male is in some ways the default, like what you were alluding to, right? Like you have the privilege of not thinking about gender.
Yeah.
So, you know, having sort of seen things from both outside and within, do you like you tend to like perceive that more and see, oh, like, you know, I am being privileged in this situation. I know you mentioned that people like pay attention to your meetings and stuff, but even when it's not interpersonal interactions, do you see it in like things like media?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the great advantage of having not lived in a male body until this point, and one that I would very easily be able to sort of just fade into the work and like relax about, is that suddenly I am the default. And I think just like white people have the need to work on being aware of that being white is the default, I think men need to be aware that being male is the default, and absolutely I notice it. I mean, it's pretty jarring actually to go from, especially having a queer body, where I really didn't fit into any gender box, to being in a situation where when I leave my house and walk down the street, a million things are happening because I'm a white male who is straight, in the world. And I never forget that, because to me that dissonance is really interesting and important and says a lot about what it is to be just a person in the world, but also because I think if I forgot that, then I would be the kind of man I didn't want to be in the first place. Other questions?
Yeah, Thomas, like this year, last year, it just seems trans understanding, I don't know the substance really, it's literally complicated.
Yeah.
But just understanding and awareness, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just been dramatic, show of things as usual, so
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm not even probably just talking about this, but so much has happened in a year and a half. I've seen it reflected in your writing. Just looking to the next year and the next 5 years, like what are you excited about? 'Cause I just see it changing, and I'm just curious kind of what you're looking forward to.
Yeah, I mean, I really bet hard on a few things for my own work. We talked a little bit at the beginning about, like, in 2010 when I was first writing, or 2011 really, about being trans and being male, there weren't any stories that were in mainstream media anyway about this stuff, except for kind of sad stories or, again, very like kind of essentialist, very reductive stories that really, in my mind, assumed the worst of the non-trans audience. Like this sort of like, oh man, we've really got to work hard to help people understand this. So like, trans people are born in the wrong body, okay, like does that make sense? And then we just made this change, and then, okay, now we're like you, so, whew, like, and I think a lot of that comes from the gatekeeping medical narrative too, like where it's like to get hormones, trans people throughout time, and a lot of trans people relate to that narrative, so that's fine, but trans people throughout time have had to, since hormones have been available, have had to basically go into a doctor's office and say, I feel trapped in the wrong body, I'm gonna kill myself if I don't make this change, and then, then therefore that's how you get your hormones. So I think in the last few years, what's really changed is social media and new media providing these platforms for those of us who are like, no, that's not quite right, it's more complicated, it's nuanced, to write those stories, but also have provided like room for people to meet us there. I think social media really encourages connection and proliferation of stories that connect and resonate with people, and I think being part of that has been really exciting, because what I bet on was that was true, that diversity in narratives would actually make a difference, and that people would meet me where I was if I just expected them to. And that's been true in my experience, and I feel like that's what we're seeing now with trans visibility in media. And then, of course, there's been like pop cultural representations like Orange is the New Black, and now Transparent, where we're just seeing more nuanced stories about trans lives. So I'm excited that I think that's going to continue, and I think that the conversations become much more about what do trans people have to say about gender broadly, rather than, wow, isn't it so weird that some people are trapped in the wrong body and now they find their new body, and it's, woof, like that was a real hard thing to think about for 5 minutes. Like now I feel like people are like, what's my gender? Like, and what does gender mean? And especially with the rise of feminism in a pop culture way, I think we're all talking about gender more, which is great. And millennials, I think specifically, are really interested in talking about gender, which is also great. So I think we're just in a very amazing watershed moment where all these things are combining. I think that's going to continue. What I'm excited to see more of is policy changes, especially for the more marginalized among us. I think, always people get forgotten in these kinds of moments. And I think, especially trans women of color who are the most adversely affected by transphobia, I'm hoping more and more that, that those folks are going to get more protections, and that we're going to be more conscientious about the violence that's still happening in these communities. That's my hope. Yes?
You mentioned going into male-dominated environments such as frat houses, bath houses. Do you ever reveal your background before going into that environment? Do you find that skews the overall experience, or do you just sit back and watch and see
What happens?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I think passing is a really interesting concept. And I think we're all passing. I mean, again, my general orientation in life is seeing the universal. So I think passing is something I never thought about until I transitioned. And a lot of people feel really uncomfortable with that word, which I totally understand. But I also feel like over time I've realized that we're all passing all the time. I mean, there's a way that we're all passing at work, we're all passing in this room, that we're passing with our families, that we're passing in the street. And it's really hard to be a fully, every dimension of yourself in every space. That being said, this project specifically, the American Man Project, is about being gonzo, which is how I think of it. I'm really interested in how men react to men without sort of knowing that there's something more dynamic going on in my background. And so, no, in this particular case, I don't make a point of it. I'm really Googleable. You can easily find out everything you need to know about my life by looking me up online, so it's certainly not a secret, but I try as much as possible to experiment with being in homosocial male spaces and reflecting back what that really means. And usually it's really surprising. I mean, I think a lot of the things you expect, of course, tend to be true, but I'm often pleasantly surprised in male spaces. I've had so many moments in like the locker room hearing like some super vulnerable conversation between two dudes about, a woman who's broken somebody's heart or whatever. I mean, it's really next level, and there's sort of a fragility there that I find really interesting. So I don't know. I don't make a point to I guess reveal that I am trans before I hang out in those spaces. Though I think it would be interesting to be in a space where someone were to know and how that might affect the situation. And probably that will happen at some point. Any other questions? Yes.
Another thing in terms of that project and going in, have you been exploring both sort of traditionally straight spaces and traditionally queer spaces for men? And what kinds of things are you seeing?
Difference, yeah. So far, I've been to a gay bathhouse, which was really interesting. What I've been most interested in in this project is like things that scare me as a man and as a trans man specifically. So I was very afraid to be in a gay bathhouse because I felt like my biology, my body physically might be sort of revealing in some way that would be scary. And that really wasn't true, and that was really interesting. And also, that one's online, you can read it, but basically like it was a tough moment in my life where my mom was very ill and I hadn't really figured out a way to process it, and actually being in this like space with a bunch of guys who were cruising each other and doing whatever else, but like, also a lot of like Hasidic guys, like where this is like the Russian Turkish baths down in, yeah. So it was like all kinds of folks and like, coexisting like together in this really interesting way, like these like Orthodox Jews and then these like gay guys who were just there to cruise at 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning and me. And so it ended up being a really beautiful experience because it was just yet another lesson that like you just show up and you're yourself, and however you are in that moment, there's room. And I was able to process a lot of feelings actually in that moment. So that's been, I mean, I don't think that there's some like grand statement I could make about like gay men are different in this way and straight men are different in this way. I don't think so at all. But I think being able to move in these different worlds and sort of reflecting back in every moment what those worlds look like has been a really cool process. The boxing story actually is a lot about class. Because I went to this amateur boxing gym where a lot of Wall Street guys were taking boxing lessons, and then also all of these like prize fighting dudes who are like putting their bodies on the line for like $500 are like working really hard to try to make that happen. And there was a lot of class tension in those spaces between the men there. So I think it's like there's all these intersections, of different identities happening at the same time, and maybe more than most people, I'm very conscious of that, and that's why I try to reflect back. Any other questions? Yes?
Kind of like struggling to understand how to like be intentional and to make myself like I guess I'm struggling to understand like how to achieve those things.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like a life process, I think. Yeah. Well, that's why I really think like the thing I was most afraid of, and the reason I wrote this book was like that these sort of terrible definitions of being male were the only options. So that's why, in a lot of ways, why I didn't transition until so late in my life. I was really trying to be like a masculine person because that was a way to be what I felt like I was without having to actually move in the world as a man, which felt really scary to me because I just had such negative associations with being male. And so much of like my personal process was about sort of realizing like I don't have to be just the things that are sold to me. Like I don't have to take on this role just because somebody says this is what men do or don't do. And for me, a lot of it was like mining what was uncomfortable or what didn't feel right and saying, you know, like, I'm not gonna do it this way. And it's not so simple, like it wasn't like, let me eschew all symbols of masculinity. There are things about being a man and being in a male body and being masculine that I really like. But it's more just that I review them. And when something comes up and makes me uncomfortable, I like sit with it for a minute and I'm like, well, what is making me uncomfortable about this? I think I'm much more nurturing now that I'm male. Because the way that I feel about being nurturing as a man feels really good to me, and it's a different way of, that way of being nurturing, like, being protective and doing things to care for people in a way that's much more sort of hands-on, that feels really good to me. I've opted into that. But I won't opt into like other aspects of like what being masculine in our culture means that make me feel uncomfortable. Like I'm not gonna be disrespectful to women because that asserts my masculinity somehow to other men, So I think it's a lot about like when something comes up that doesn't feel good, sort of figuring out, well, what is that and why doesn't it feel good and do I want to really be that and and that sort of thing. And actually listening a lot to women specifically, because I think we're having a lot of conversations in our culture right now about, catcalling and like what it's like at work and like leaning in or whatever, and why do we have to lean in or can women have it all? And it's like, those questions aren't irrelevant to men because we're all participating in the same, in the same dynamics. So, being willing to like look at something just because it makes you a better person, not just because it's like, oh, I might want to help out my girlfriend or my mom or my sister or whatever by thinking about this. So that's where I would start. But a lot of it's just, again, making the fact that men have a gender a visible thing, because then women for years, because of feminism, have, I think, really had a way to like engage with the idea of gender. Like, if a woman wants to wear really feminine clothes and dress up and whatever, and she wants to opt into that to go to work one day, like maybe she's making a really conscious feminist choice to do that. I think men haven't had the same thoughts around like, well, do I want to be, whatever, do I want to take boxing classes? Like why, like do I want to, whatever I'm doing, is it for a reason that feels good to me? Or am I choosing consciously to do this thing because I want to, or am I just doing it because I'm supposed to, and actually it's really constricting, and maybe even harmful to other people. So that's where I started. Yeah.
So my sister had a baby some months ago, and when I told people about it, they would ask, first thing they always ask was, is it a boy or a girl?
Right.
It's kind of annoyed me a little because I was like, that is not the most important thing.
No.
And so I wouldn't tell them. I noticed it would drive them crazy.
I'm sure,
like they
yeah.
would not stop asking.
Yeah.
So of course, the more this happened, the less I wanted to tell them.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this, like the really strong gender socialization that happened.
Isn't it so interesting that like what we're really asking is like, what kind of person is this person going to be? Like we can know somehow by like knowing if the person's born with one body or another body. I agree that it's a really troubling thing. I really like when parents don't find out or like wait. But I also think like all things, like there's sort of I think it's overly idealistic to assume we won't put expectations on our children or on each other based on what gender we think a person is. Like I think of course we do. Life is complicated and like it's a way we make sense of the world. And these are systems of operating. Again, I think it goes back to like, is there a way to integrate and to understand this? This is a paradox where on one hand, gender is probably pretty innate for most of us and for all of us. And most of us are born in a body that we don't want to change. But even so, we need to operate in a way that we understand like the cultural and institutional like expectations that come along with those bodies, and like it's very restricting to all of us when we assume that because somebody looks one way, therefore everything about them is going to be this way, So I guess to me like there's not some simple solution of like, well, if we just raise our children agendered, like then somehow that will like solve all of our problems. I think probably not. I think probably the best thing we can do is teach our kids that like, gender is complex and nuanced, and there's no right way to be, and encourage them to just be themselves and look, model that for our kids and for each other. Yes?
How have you been using the word intentionally construct the body?
That's really great. No one's asked me that. It's a great question. Thank you. I think a lot of queer people have a lot of tattoos, and probably a lot for the same reason. It's a way to be in the world in a way that feels intentional, and sort of claim your body as your own in a space where people don't always understand it. For me personally, as just a human being, I have found tattooing, like ritual in general, is like a very, it's a way for me to operate culturally so that the world makes sense to me. And like these tattoos are a lion and a lamb. And I got them in the last like 6 months, and it was a lot for me about a few different things. One was feeling secure enough professionally to get job stoppers, which I always promised myself I would do to mark that. And also, like, the idea of the lion and the lamb, which, I don't know, ironically, actually, this is not, in the story, I don't think it's a lion and a lamb at all. I've later found out it's a lamb and, like, a fox or something in the Bible. But just the concept, I guess, that, like, we need to integrate both parts of ourselves, our fierceness and our gentleness, in order to operate in a fully human way. I really liked that, and so every sort of moment of my life that I've like had some sort of big realization about the person I am in the world, I usually mark it with some sort of tattoo, and I find the ritual of that very, it's a great way to mark time. Time isn't linear anyway, we all know that, so how do we like mark our lives in a way that contains them in some way, and there's a story behind it. The best part about writing this book really was that like, I got to not only assert my identity in a world that didn't always understand it, but also to like assert my understanding of just the way life operates. It's a book that really, time is kind of like always in a vortex. And I think that's how memory works and how life works, is we are organized much more thematically than we think, and much less in a way that's like linear and it's less spatial, it's more thematic. So in a lot of ways, I think that's just tattooing, writing a book, being an artist in any way is about being able to operate in that realm. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you have any comments about non-standard genders?
Like
not cis or trans male or female?
Yeah. I mean, what are you really asking me?
I'm inviting you to say something about that. I don't have an actual question. How one could construct an identity as either or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I think gender is complex and nuanced, and I really believe there's something innate to gender, which is so interesting to me anyway, because I came of age in like the queer 90s, where it was very like, being, post-gender was like kind of that was the big idea, and I spent a lot of time trying to be post-gender, and it just didn't work for me personally. Like, I really felt like I had a gender and it was male, and that was complicated. But I think a lot of people are innately in some other space with that, and I think that's really cool and important too, and that no gender is, obviously being able to pass as male in a male body is really a lot easier, and again, that goes back to the privilege, and being able to pass in a lot of ways as a woman in a female body is really easy too, in a different way, but plus sexism. So we are really privileged in those ways, and that people who are non-conforming aren't. So just in the same way that I think we need to make space for other stories, like about trans bodies, we certainly need to make space for people's gender identities that aren't as conforming to those standards. I mean, gender is a spectrum, we all know that. So I guess the only thing I have to say about it is that those are really important identities too. Just doesn't happen to be mine. Yeah?
What's next for your own construction?
I think I really love that I can change the conversation to be more than about being trans. Like, I think early on, and it just sort of parallels my own life, like I really was interested in being trans because that's what I was operating from a place of thinking about all the time in the first couple of years of my transition. And over time, I've realized that just like my body in the world isn't read as a trans body, my interest in the world is much more about what does it mean to be a male body. And so I continue to, like, at least for now, like really be interested in that question and like thinking about how being male affects like the space around me and vice versa. So I think in my construction, I'm still constructing my male self and being the kind of man I want to be, not necessarily the kind of trans man I want to be, though that's clearly related. And so being able to talk to men and ask these questions and be in male spaces and bring this stuff up is still something I'm negotiating and figuring out how to do well, and I want to keep doing until I nail it. So probably for the rest of my life. Anything else, you guys? This is such a great group.
Another mundane question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I remember being, 17 and like getting facial hair for the first time and being like, oh no, is this cool? Is this annoying? And like, it literally took me like years to like decide if I wanted to be clean shaven and have a beard.
Yeah.
I imagine you must have had to go through these same things with a slightly different twist on it.
Yeah, for sure.
What was that like?
I mean, so every Halloween until this one, well, not until this one, until the last few, I always was like something where I got to have like a fake beard, like a mascara beard. I was like really committed to the beard situation. So as soon as I was on testosterone, like I immediately was trying to grow a beard because that was like, I didn't have a lot of ideas about what I wanted to look like. It's kind of an interesting thing to be like kind of reborn in a body that you already live in. And testosterone especially is interesting because it really is just turning on genes that already exist. So like I really had a man inside me, literally, and we all have, women and men, female and male bodies inside of our bodies, which is like interesting to think about, at least to me. So I had no idea what my body would do, and so I was worried about not having a beard, and also I was worried about going bald, which might still happen. So like all men, I think those are the two primary things I was thinking about during like, coming into adulthood, but my process was very accelerated. So I was really excited to try to grow a beard. I think it's worked out okay. I feel very lucky. But yeah, for me, like that was something, it was one small thing that was really important to me. A lot of other things, people have different things that are important to them that they are hoping will happen for their bodies, like we all have. And that for me, facial hair was one for me that I was really excited about. So, but if I hadn't had a beard, I would have lived like all guys who can't grow beards. You obviously picked to go with the beard route, and it worked out well for you. Other questions? Yes.
Have you felt that being on testosterone has changed anything about like who you are as a person, your personality?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think about it a lot. I think it's extremely hard to separate all of this stuff from each other. I mean, in the years since I've been on testosterone, I have moved to New York from New England. I like ended a very long relationship. I had a lot of things happen in my career. I mean, so many things have happened, and I really became an adult. So it's really hard for me to know, well, this part of it came from testosterone, and this part of it, I don't know. I do think that, I do think hormones affect our bodies, and I do think that there are ways, for me personally, that testosterone has probably affected how I behave. It's just really hard to know exactly what, and also it's like, probably, yes, probably for example, I probably am more assertive. On the other hand, am I more assertive because I'm on testosterone or because people expect me to be more assertive? Or am I because I'm rewarded for being assertive in ways I wasn't before? I just don't know the answer, I think my relationship certainly with and I've heard a lot of people talk about this, with crying is different. It's harder for me to cry, though I still can, but it's it's just a little bit more difficult to do, literally physically. I feel like I have to cry and I can't sometimes. I've had to relearn how, which is interesting. And then when I do, it's way more intense, but way shorter. So what is that? I don't know. I don't think that's social. I think that's something physical with my body, but I can't figure out exactly what's going on. So yeah, so a lot of it, I don't know. It's really hard to pull it apart. I definitely think my honest answer is I am absolutely positive there are ways that I have been affected by these hormones. I just don't know what they are. Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. Well, you guys have been awesome. This has been a really great group.
Yeah,
And
thanks so much. We're out of questions. We still have the room for a few minutes. There are books in the back. If you would like to get them signed,
yeah,
now's a good time.
yeah, please feel free to buy a book if you'd like. And thanks so much, you guys.